My guest this evening on Biz First in Focus is the High Commissioner for Sri Lanka and Maldives representing Britain, Mr. James Doris. A very good evening and welcome to the show, Mr. High Commissioner.
Good evening. It's nice to be here.
Nice to have you as well on board. Starting off, how has your experiences in Peru? You were the High Commissioner in Peru, and then you were also working or serving Colombia and Moscow. And how has these missions prepared you for your posting in Sri Lanka?
You're right. Before coming to Sri Lanka, I was our ambassador in Peru for 4 years. I also served in Colombia for 4 years. You have the general experience of running a mission, which I think is important here. Also, of course, Peru and Colombia are two countries which have also been through serious internal conflicts. I think that the experiences I gathered there, I learned there, are useful, certainly interesting in the context of the issues that Sri Lankans are thinking about today.
I understand that you first came to Sri Lanka as an English teacher when you were just 18 years of age. Could you explain how it has helped you shape your view of Sri Lanka and how you think it will help you with your new posting, Mr. High Commissioner?
As you say, I first came to Sri Lanka 31 years ago and I fell in love with Sri Lanka, I fell in love with India at the time. In fact, I returned to India to teach a second time 5 years afterwards. And I think it is a real affection for the region which is important for me in my approach to my work as I look to build our long-standing bilateral relationship further up.
With regard to your meeting with Sri Lankan corporate executives and the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, you mentioned, Mr. High Commissioner, that it was our responsibility to ensure our companies sell our values and not just our products. Could you please elaborate on the values that these companies should sell?
When I talked to the Chamber, I was suggesting that an important role for companies is not just selling products successfully, but also selling values. And companies do influence the way we think. They influence the way that their employees think. They influence them through the prioritisation they give to their values. And as I say, I think that our economies, our success as countries depends on the success of our businesses. And therefore companies' ability to project positive values, the sorts of values we want to see in our societies, is important.
Mr. High Commissioner, diplomatic ties between Sri Lanka and the United Kingdom dates back many years. However, during the last few years, the relationship has somewhat strained. Agreed or disagreed?
Our relationship wasn't the easiest in the last years of Mahinda Rajapaksa's government. We welcomed the chance to reinvigorate aspects of the relationship which weren't flourishing as much as I think we all hoped they would do during that period. At the same time, of course, lots of areas of our strong and varied bilateral relationship, education, trade, investment, have continued to grow strongly throughout the period.
What would you be doing differently than your predecessor in terms of strengthening relationship between the UK and Sri Lanka?
I plan to take forward many of the same areas, essentially, that my predecessor was taking forwards. We have had a change of government, in a sense, in the UK, in that we had an election in May. We saw a Conservative government elected, replacing the previous Conservative Liberal coalition government. But the general thrust of our policy and our ambition for a really positive relationship between Britain and Sri Lanka is unchanged.
On the 14th of April, we were speaking about the Conservative government coming into power. The election manifesto of the current British government outlined its commitment to the UN investigation into Sri Lankan atrocities, pledged to work towards a political settlement for Tamils in Sri Lanka. Would this have contributed in any way for the Conservative government to come into power, Mr. High Commissioner?
I can't say because I don't know how individuals voted. It's worth noting, of course, that we do have an important Sri Lankan diaspora living in the UK, and members of the Sri Lankan diaspora, of course, voted in the election.
What was the thinking behind this, Mr. High Commissioner, when you mentioned about when your government mentioned about Sri Lanka in its election manifesto? First time ever it has happened.
It was the Conservative Party that mentioned it in the manifesto, of course.
They're now in power.
They're now in power. As your viewers will know, our Prime Minister, David Cameron, took a strong position when he came to Sri Lanka in November 2013 for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And Britain, as a friend of Sri Lanka, with other friends of Sri Lanka in the international community, is concerned still to see Sri Lankans and Sri Lanka take forward a process which will help the island, to help Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans find a way towards the sort of lasting peace, stability that we know people here want.
Has the position of the British government changed since the election of a new government, a new president on the 8th of January this year in Sri Lanka?
In March this year, President Sirisena visited London, and his visit was extremely welcome, and that public prioritisation by the President of his ambition for the relationship between Sri Lanka and Britain was very welcome. While he was in London, he met the Queen, he met the Prime Minister, he had a series of very constructive meetings.
The President emphasised during his meeting in Britain, Mr. High Commissioner, that a new mechanism will be introduced to address accountability issues and bring in reconciliation in the country. Have you seen a document? It's several months since the meeting now.
I haven't seen a document, no, though I know from discussions I've had with ministers that the government is actively developing its thoughts.
Is the Cabinet in consultation with your government with regard to drafting this particular mechanism or even the accountability document that was supposed to come into light in the next few weeks or months?
We're not involved in drafting the mechanism. Mm-hmm. I think the important thing is for the Sri Lankan government to maintain an active conversation with the UN, which I know it is doing.
The United Nations High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka is due in September this year, that is a few months from now. Your government co-sponsored a resolution on Sri Lanka. Have you been able to see this particular reporting question?
The report is the UN's report. No, we haven't seen a copy of the report.
What would your government like to see in this report?
It's very much up to the UN what it puts into the report.
Do you all want to exert pressure on the United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner on this particular reporting question?
The UN High Commissioner, as you say, is leading on this process. He's leading on it in close with his team in Geneva.
Is the OHCHR in consultation with the US and the UK in drafting this reporting question?
No, we're not. We're not consulting with the UN.
Has the position of the British government changed since last September?
In respect to
the United Nations Human Rights High Commissioner's activities on accountability and reconciliation issues in Sri Lanka?
No, we continue to think that the UN has an important and useful role to play in helping Sri Lanka take forward its thinking on these important issues.
Your government, you said initially that somewhat has changed its policy towards Sri Lanka. You said that there was a bouncy period during the former regime's era as well. Do you think that your government was acting with bias during the last few years, and suddenly when a new government comes into play on the 8th of January this year, you all change its position?
As I said earlier on, I don't think there has been a change of policy. What we sense is that there's been a change in the nature of the opportunity. And I think we think, and certainly Sri Lankans I have talked to also feel, that there is an exciting opportunity for us to develop further the potential in our relationship, which goes across education, sports, trade, investment, a whole range of different issues.
Opportunity, what does that mean, Mr. High Commissioner? Does that mean that your government wants to interfere into affairs in Sri Lanka, or giving opportunities in respect of trade ties? What does this opportunity really mean, Mr. High Commissioner?
Our role as a High Commissioner is very much to help promote the whole of Britain's relationship with Sri Lanka. It's not just about government attitudes. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I have a trade team in the High Commission. An important part of their role is helping ensure that trade between our countries grows and investments flourish.
Now, there's a general notion, Mr. High Commissioner, in Sri Lanka that the West, including Britain, have got more leverage to intervene into internal affairs in Sri Lanka subsequent to the 8th of January this year. Agreed or disagreed?
I'm slightly puzzled by the word intervene. Our interest, as I said, is in developing a relationship across a whole range of different areas. We have a lot of areas where, of course, we share concerns. Climate change is one of those, and we're going to have an important meeting on climate change in Paris in December this year. Concerns.
Are you all not concerned anymore about human rights issues in Sri Lanka?
Human rights issues are important for us in the UK and around the world.
So what steps would your government be taking in respect of this in the next few months?
We continue to work closely with UN and international mechanisms for evaluating human rights. All of us submit human rights reviews for periodic review. Britain does, Sri Lanka does. And we will continue to take an active part in commenting on and helping friends around the world to develop better human rights, which is very much what Geneva and the international human rights interests is about.
The 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in Sri Lanka a couple of months ago, Mr. High Commissioner, if you may recollect right. Yesterday, speaking at the UNHCR sessions, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Zaid al-Razad, said that there's renewed hope here in Sri Lanka following the adoption of this amendment in question. What are your thoughts about the 19th Amendment to the Constitution?
I presented my credentials to your President just after the passing of the 19th Amendment, and at the time I congratulated him on his success in moving the amendment through Parliament. It was a measure into which he clearly put a tremendous amount of personal effort. And I think the change is, from my sense, has been welcomed by Sri Lankans. It's the welcome by Sri Lankans that matters.
Your government supported President Maithripala Sirisena's 100-day program. The program ended on the 23rd of April, promising an election. What are your views on this?
We didn't support the programme as such. We welcomed many of the ambitions set out in the programme. Clearly, there's been a lot of evaluation in the media here about the degree to which the President has achieved all of the many objectives set out in that 100-day plan. But there have been important steps forward. One of those is the 19th Amendment passage.
The 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which outlines electoral reforms, what is the position of the British government on this amendment?
We watch with interest. We don't take a position. How Sri Lanka organises its voting system, changes it makes to the voting system, are very much changes for Sri Lanka's political parties.
However, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was a key concern of your government, Mr. High Commissioner.
No, what I did was congratulate the President on its passage. Again, the decision on whether or not Sri Lanka should have an executive presidency, the decision on whether or not Sri Lanka should shift away from an executive presidency, as the 19th Amendment clearly in part achieves, is very much a decision for this island.
Mr. High Commissioner, is Sri Lanka on the right track?
On the right track to
achieving reconciliation, accountability, human rights, giving the opportunity for its people following the end of a conflict. It's 6 years following the end of the conflict. Are we on the right track?
It's hard to say what the right track is. What I can say is, for example, I was in the north of Sri Lanka recently, and I did sense a real sense of positive change there. I also sensed that a lot of work needs to be done still. But many of the people I talked to welcomed changes that have taken place, while also being keen to tell me that, as I say, a lot more needs to be done and there are big challenges still ahead.
Mr. High Commissioner, human rights define. How can Sri Lanka achieve human rights in the eyes of the international community?
Human rights, of course, cover a very broad field of civil, political, fundamental rights of all sorts. I think the important thing is to move forwards with your commitment to those and to seeing those implemented.
Mr. High Commissioner, you just said that being on the right track cannot be defined exactly. How can Sri Lanka know that they have achieved human rights? They are respecting human rights and they are acting on the intentions of the international community. What is the benchmark to define human rights?
I think the various agreements, international agreements to which Sri Lanka is party, are the best source documents to answer your question. I don't have them in front of me, so I can't quote from them word by word. But the intentions set out there about respect for human rights, as they're defined in the conventions, is clear.
Intentions. Do you see that the present government having a clear intention to address the accountability issues in Sri Lanka, especially what happened during the final stages of the conflict?
I think that the next few months are going to be important, and Sri Lanka's presentation in Geneva in September is going to be important in helping a lot of people in and outside the country understand better where the country is going to.
What is the way forward for Sri Lanka, politically, economically?
Again, I think the political question is a question which is for Sri Lankans
What is
to
the way
answer.
forward? General, let's put it into a general perspective. What is the way forward for a country like Sri Lanka, following 6 years following the end of the conflict?
I've heard a lot since I've been here about Sri Lanka's ambition to attract international investment, to develop industrial strengths in new areas. I've talked to companies like Millennium IT, a subsidiary of the London Stock Exchange Group, which employs a large number of highly talented Sri Lankan software engineers. And I think that ambition to make that leap in many cases is admirable. Education is clearly important, and prioritisation, what I've heard about the prioritisation of education is admirable. I've been interested to see the shift in policy, and the number of people I've talked to who've welcomed the introduction of Sinhala and Tamil teaching in schools.
Trade ties between Sri Lanka and the United Kingdom dates back many years, Mr. High Commissioner. How do you intend to strengthen the relationship between both countries?
Sri Lanka currently sells a lot more to Britain than Britain sells to Sri Lanka. So one of my ambitions is to certainly raise the level of British exports to Sri Lanka. But of course, this is very much a case of selling to the other country what the other country wants to buy. And I think it's a credit to Sri Lankan manufacturers and Sri Lankan exporters that they are producing so much that British companies and British consumers do want to buy.
Considering the UK's and Sri Lanka's long-term relationship, Mr. High Commissioner, as you did mention right now, your recognition of both the progress within Sri Lanka and the strong relationship between the two countries, why have you denied the possibility of easing the current visa regulations to Sri Lankan citizens?
I haven't denied the possibility. What I have said is that, first, most importantly, we will continue to warmly welcome Sri Lankans who want to come to the UK. We have a very large number of Sri Lankan students, for example, studying in Britain. They are extremely welcome, and we have some great universities. Certainly, as you know, we have a visa regime, visa system in place. I can't say anything to your viewers about changing the provisions of the regime, but we do try to operate it in a manner which is efficient and friendly and ensures that Sri Lankans who want to visit the UK for good reason.
Next year, that is in April, the tenure of this present Parliament will end, Mr. High Commissioner. Will your government welcome a change in regime?
In Parliament?
In Parliament.
We welcome the exercise of democracy, so the fact there are parliamentary elections is a welcome thing. Of course, we in the High Commission, along with, I'm sure, most of your viewers, wait to see what the outcome of the parliamentary elections here are with a lot of interest.
Did your government dislike the former regime?
Did we dislike the former regime? No, I wouldn't say we did dislike the former regime. We had our differences. We also had a number of areas where our bilateral relationship continued to grow. There were areas where we had some serious concerns. As I said earlier in the programme, the Prime Minister highlighted during his visit here in November 2013.
6 years following the end of the conflict in Sri Lanka, what is the message you have for the people and the politicians in the country?
Moving on from conflict is extremely difficult. We know that, not least from our own experience of moving on from many decades of conflict in Northern Ireland. I think a key message, I'm not sure it's a message which best comes from me, but a message would be that the more that everyone can commit to playing a part in resolving differences that have underlain tensions in society here, just as there are underlain tensions in our society at home, the more that people can commit to doing that, the better.
Ms. High Commissioner, taking into account what you said right now, the Northern Ireland issue, it still persists somewhat in the region. Do you think Sri Lanka needs that time and space to raise its head following the end of the conflict? Isn't this the opportunity that should be given by the international community for Sri Lanka to raise its head?
I think conflict resolution takes time. I was in Belfast in December last year, and I saw a city which is still working its way through post-conflict issues. These issues run deep, and they do take time, certainly. But in terms of taking time, I think the important thing is to keep on pressing. taking time doesn't mean sitting doing nothing. Taking time means investing in trying to move forwards, recognising that you're not always going to get everything right, but maintaining that sense of ambition and drive is going to be key, we think in our own case, to achieving in Belfast the sort of society that people in Belfast, most of them, would like to have.
Time is needed. Space is needed.
Conflict resolution does take time.
So Sri Lanka's call for space and time is justified in the eyes of the British government.
Conflict resolution takes time, and I think that the approach in Geneva very much recognises that this isn't about quick fixes, it's not about immediate solutions, it's about movement down a road which will get Sri Lanka to a good place and give it the sort of assurance of a peaceful future that everyone in this country is looking for.
Mr. High Commissioner, let's move on to the political situation, the political climate in the Maldives, because you're also the British High Commissioner for the Maldives. How do you view the arrest of former Maldivian President Mohammed Nasheed? Has this in some way strained the relationship between Maldives and Britain?
We firmly believe in democracy, and of course with Sri Lanka, the Maldives and Britain are all members of the Commonwealth, and one of the central tenets of the Commonwealth, one of the things that holds us together, is our commitment to and belief in the importance of democratic systems. The arrest of any former president in any state is a serious business. The international community and respected international organisations made very clear their concern not so much about the arrest of President Nasheed, former President Nasheed, as of the manner of conduct of his trial, which, as I say, a number of respected international legal organisations made clear they had real concerns about.
What are your views on President Barack Obama's administration's internal pressure to lobby for the release of all political prisoners, including former President Mohammed Nasheed?
I've seen the letter from John McCain. I've read John Kerry's comments. I haven't actually seen, or I can't recall seeing any comment by President Obama.
President Obama has said that the U.S. would pressure the authorities in Maldives to release the former president who is now serving a prison sentence. Mr. High Commissioner, what is your views on this? Do you all agree, or do you all stand with the United States with regard to releasing the political prisoners, including former President Mohammed Nasheed?
As a general point of principle, we very much share the US view. We as the UK are firm in our own view that political prisoners are in prison for people should not be in prison for their political views.
Mr. High Commissioner, my final question to you is, your job becomes very tough considering the human rights record across the globe and the involvement of the United Kingdom in many countries. Let's take a look at countries like Libya, let's take a look at countries like Syria. How do you tackle all this and then talk about a country like Sri Lanka?
I think the human rights needs to be tackled by the international community. This is a problem. These are issues of principle which we all believe to be important, and which we therefore are best off working as a community in addressing both in our own countries and in encouraging others to address in their countries.
Mr. High Commissioner, thank you very much for joining us this evening on Biz First in Focus. I hope you all the very best for your tenure here in Sri Lanka as the High Commissioner for Sri Lanka and the Maldives. Thank you very much again.
A pleasure. Thank you.